Hello everyone and welcome to another slideshow here on my channel. I'm Cody and today I'll be taking a look at Turkey's next generation main battle tank, the Altay. This topic comes courtesy of a poll from my community tab here on YouTube, so don't forget to check that out. If y'all could also leave a like, subscribe, and ring that notification bell, that'd be great. Plus, if you've got any thoughts or comments, pop them down below. Speaking of comments, let me know if I've missed anything. But for now, the credits. Of course, a lot of the base information comes from the wikis out there, and anytime I'm talking tanks, you know I'm going to bring up the Tank Encyclopedia. Their graphics are great, their information's great, they're overall a great resource. We also have the Defense Post with a recent article we'll talk about in a bit, and of course, my inspirations and influences here on YouTube, ranging from educational with the Tank Museum to the little wacky, little wild laser pig. So why is any of this important? I mean, it's not even in active production yet, so why even talk about it? Well, it's Turkey Month and y'all wanted it, plus a little tank talk is always fun. Outside of just the fun of it, and to provide, well, at least the basics, Turkey is often forgotten when looking at the big picture, chalking it either up to being just a portion of NATO, or just Turkey being kind of irrelevant to most people that live outside of Turkey or the region. It's no India, but it is a pole of power in its own right, being kind of the rebel within NATO. Having that independent streak comes with some troubles if you're looking at arms supply from the US. Turkey has now partnered with Hyundai Rotem to make their own indigenous tank project loosely related to the K2 Black Panther. Not only does this push them further from being reliant on NATO or the US for arms deals, but also will help with their interventions, especially if they're not overly popular with NATO, the US, or the EU. Along with all that, the Altay may also be the first derivative of the K2 to see combat, giving us our first real idea of how at least the chassis handles combat. So what details am I going to be covering? Well, first we'll cover a little background, then we'll take a look at Turkey's current stable of tanks, then the K2 specifications, the Altay specifications, some of the differences, and the possible operational areas they may be seen in. And of course, I'll close things out with my personal thoughts. It should be a fairly quick rundown, but regardless, thanks for sticking through it. So to start this topic, we gotta roll all the way back to 2007 to the start of this specific project. However, I do believe it's important to note that an indigenous tank project has been in the works in Turkey since the 90s. While the project would find its final form, or somewhat final form, with Hyundai Rotem's K2, Turkey was rather adamant that they make as much of it in-house as they possibly could instead of importing or just seeking a licensed production run. Largely speaking, the prototypes we've seen so far don't look like a massive departure from the K2 base, but we do see a little bit of a Turkey spin on making the Altay itself instead of just a K2T. Gotta say, this was good timing as the first two test tanks were delivered back in April, which, if everything goes well, will put the tank on track to start mass production in 2025. While official records and results from these tests likely won't be public, at least for a while, we'll probably have a better idea of what the final production run will look like closer to that 2025 mark. Now, before we look too far to the forward into the future, let's take a look at the here and now. Turkey operates a variety of tanks ranging from the old school M48 Pattons to more modern Leopard 2 A4s. And if you thought all the Ukrainian sticking ERA brick memes were funny, you're going to love Turkey because they do the same and they've done a lot of it to the M60. Yeah, that thing in the bottom right is a quote-unquote modernized Vietnam-era tank. Now, I'm not 100% sure how many of each of these are still actively in service and what roles they may play, but either upgrade packages and new turrets for older designs are popping up fairly regularly, and I get the vibe a lot of the older stock is relatively operational or has been scavenged for parts, and what does exist can probably be brought back into service somewhat quickly. Since I didn't find any super concrete numbers for operational units, I'll just cover how many were delivered and kind of go from there. So let's work our way backwards and start with the super not controversial Turkish Leopard 2A4s. or at least the Leopard 2s, since Turkey actually fields a couple different variants. You have the A2 and the A3 and the 2A3 and 2A4, with having 355 units delivered to the Turkish Armed Forces, with some of those being updated or modified to the TR or T1T standard. I've seen both designations, but I'm not 100% sure they're fully interchangeable, but they do kind of look similar, so it's hard to say. Rolling back to the Leopard 1s, though, we have some Leopard 1A3s, Leopard 1A4s, and once again, a 1T variant, which all of them kind of look like minor modifications for Turkish use, so the 1Ts are probably relatively similar to the base production units. While some companies offer full-on modernized turrets, the Leopard 1s don't seem to be getting those from the Turks, at least right now. Next, we have the M60s and all their variants with some likely overlapping data. With 785 delivered to the Turks, it's fair to say they have a lot of these on hand and have tried to keep them relevant, as we can see. However, it looks like quite a few of these tanks were recounted after upgrade packages, and this is kind of where wiki information gets a little meh. They're usually good for hard stats, but in instances like this, it's good to be skeptical. We'll talk about them more in a moment, but the Turkish company Rokstan, I hope, has a whole host of armor packages and turret upgrades for older tanks, the M60 being one of them. You can go find that stuff on their website. It's actually really fun to look at. Then lastly, we have just about as many old M84s. Keeping in mind this variant has been upgunned to the 105mm gun, they could still be fairly viable on the battlefield, but they're definitely not the top of the line. Now, if you've been around for a while, you know I've talked about the K2 a lot, probably more than any other individual tank on my channel. I'll try to run through this as quickly as possible, but also not too fast, and cover the basics. So we've got the CN 08 120mm 55 caliber smoothbore gun with a 16 round clip for the autoloader and 40 rounds stored. Depending on the type of ammunition it's using in battlefield conditions, it can reach out and touch something anywhere from 3 to 8 kilometers away. We have no real idea what the composite armor is made of. Please do not War Thunder me, guys. Keep that stuff a secret. It also uses some ERA to some extent and an indigenously developed APS system that I'm not super familiar with. It's a light one coming in at 55 tons with a top speed of 43 miles an hour. It can operate around 280 miles with its overall operational range and forward waterways up to 4 meters with some preparation. As mentioned earlier, the autoloader cuts the crew down to 3 of the commander, driver, and gunner. Last but most definitely not least is the semi-active hydropneumatic suspension system, effectively making this the most lethal lowrider to have ever existed. So now that we know what the Altay is based on, let's see what the Altay itself is rocking. We have the MKE 120mm 55 caliber smoothbore gun. However, this version, at least to my knowledge, doesn't utilize an autoloader. However, the possibility of future units having this is at least there. But it can house 40 rounds have the same effective firing range as the K2, once again depending on conditions and ammunition. It does use a composite armor made by, once again, Rokstan, or Rokstan? Correct me in the comments. Based on the Korean armor design used for their K1, A1 tanks, which also served as the basis for the K2 armor design. We also have an indigenous APS system in development, but since it's in development, we don't know too much about it. It is 10 tons heavier, coming in at 65 tons with the extra weight, bringing the top speed down to about 40 miles an hour, but that's pretty standard for most modern main battle tanks. Surprisingly, we have the same listed operational range. However, since the first batch of Altays are starting testing, I imagine we'll see that change over time. It can also forward waterways up to 4 meters and rocks a crew of 4 with the commander, driver, gunner, and loader. So what is Turkey aiming to produce domestically instead of relying on parts from South Korea? Well, we won't know until mass production truly starts, but at least the first 2 batches give us an idea. The low-rate production batches of 1 and 2 will be split between batch 1 being primarily South Korean-sourced parts, at least for big things, and batch 2 is going to be Turkish-produced parts. Starting off with the armor, we have the Rokstan armor package based once again off the Korean Special Armor Plate, which isn't one-to-one, but from my understanding is pretty similar. We also have Aslan's Akhor system, which is still in development. That's their APS system. And to my knowledge, it is a fully indigenous effort. It's not based on anything else, but if I'm wrong, once again, pop it in the comments. The MKE 120mm gun is a licensed but modified version of the K2 CN08. This does lead me to believe the Turks do have the option eventually to change it out to an autoloader if they decide to. However, it's hard to say what modifications were actually made and if it has kind of removed that capability. Now, to the real big differences we'll see in full production possibly in 2025. We have Batch 1 rocking Hyundai Tucson's DV27K diesel engine putting out 1500 horsepower. We also have the S&T Dynamics EST15K transmission. This is basically the K2 setup for reference. In Batch 2, we'll see Turkey's own BMC Power try their hand with their Batu series V12 engine and transmission system. Same output horsepower-wise, but with it being put through its paces, we don't actually have any idea of what either of these will look like until we get to the final production models in 2025. You know me, I gotta talk about some geography though. Now, with my mug flags, because flags were too mainstream, I guess, I don't know, I just like how they look. I think it matches my banner on YouTube, and I like how they look. Anyway, let's start with the northern Iraq and Syria regions and the Kurdish question, which is more likely than not going to be the bigger situation as opposed to the conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh. For the most part, we'll be looking at mostly flat desertous regions with some waterways and some mountains starting in Turkey's southeastern corner. The Zagros Mountains are a little bit more northern in Iraq than they are into Syria, but they do kind of decline into Syria and southeastern Turkey, so you do have that kind of extra feature. While the desert isn't the best place to operate, it is easier to maneuver in than a mountain range like the Caucasus. And that leads me to believe the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan, Armenia backed by the CSTO in Russia, Azerbaijan backed by Turkey, is probably not going to see a lot of these, if any. The conflict did heat up back in 2021 and would introduce the world to the now famous TB2 Bayraktar, but I wouldn't imagine we'll see Altay anytime soon. But the possibility does exist, especially if Turkey ends up trying to try their hand in the arms production game. Which leads me to my personal thoughts and conclusions. In summation, this tank could be just enough of a different form from the K2 that Turkey can really expand its capabilities as an arms supplier, especially if they have some kind of export deal with Hyundai Rotem. Now, that's not to say their angle is focused on that, but I would imagine the conversations have happened. With Russia's arm industry reputation being at least somewhat tarnished and their production capabilities focused on Putin's 3-day war, countries that would usually buy these pieces of equipment are going to need an alternative to the pricier American and German tanks. Now, of course, the K2 does exist, and then the Altay can help fill that gap just as the TB2 has as a lower-cost combat drone capability. There are a lot of places Turkey's already stationing troops, some of which are UN and NATO missions, but still, there are a lot of places that would normally be buying Russian equipment, so it's just my thought that maybe Turkey's already got their foot in the door and maybe they're trying to expand. Now, of course, it'll be a while before we see the Altay actually in production and then by the point that they could start exporting even more, but the bug is in my ear and I imagine that is a possibility maybe in the next decade or two. Anyway, let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. If I'm crazy, let me know. If I'm not and you think I've got some good points, let me know. Anyway, thanks for sticking with me for this roughly 15-minute video. I know it was short, but we've run through a lot of it before. Thanks. I'll see you in the next one.